A very warm welcome to our Dial Global virtual workshop, weekly virtual workshop with the superb Diane Lightfoot. Diane's going to be talking to us today about a whole host of different facets around both visible and invisible diversity. She is the Chief Executive Officer for the Business Disability Forum, leading organisation when it comes to disability inclusion. And I know that a number of you probably already do know Diane, or you know her face, you've seen her in the press, you've seen her doing fantastic things, you know. And yeah, you know, I'd love you all to be able to get to know Diane a little bit better, hear about some of the great work that she's doing, and also perhaps very briefly, just to start off with, whilst I get your presentation up, Diane, hear about how Diane came to be where she is today. Now, you can all ask questions, of course, and we've got two question boxes. We've got a poll here as well, actually, so question and answer, or the chat box, either or. I'll be keeping an eye on everything, as will the team who I know are in the background. So do make sure you're asking away. Don't be shy. Keep asking, and we will also have question and answer at the end as well. But Diane, a warm welcome and thank you so much for doing this for us. We're really super grateful and very proud that you also are on our review committee as well for the Not-for-Profit Foundation.
Yes, thank you, Layla, and thank you for such a glowing welcome. I shall do my best to live up to that billing. But we're very, very pleased to support the review last year and this year, and also the Dial Global Summit 3 weeks ago, I think now. 3 weeks, yes, time does fly. So it's really great to be doing this with you. And in terms of me and how I got here, I was going to start talking a bit about the organisation and what we do. So I have been working in the disability sector now for, oh goodness me, I think it's 17 years. 17 years. And I worked from a marketing comms background, and then sort of policy, and sort of acquired things as you do as you go on. And I was working for 13 years for a learning disability charity, which had some employment services. And as part of that, I kind of realised how all the things that we kind of take for granted around independence and identity and social inclusion, and obviously financial independence as well, they just fall into place when someone has a job and has a good job. And I was working at that time for an organisation that mainly worked with adults with learning disabilities, so the group sort of furthest from the labour market. And it just kind of struck me that when we meet people, we still say, what do you do? It's one of the first questions we ask people. And I thought for too many people with a learning disability, and actually too many disabled people generally, that's a difficult question to answer. And that's when I became passionate about disability and employment. And then when coming up for, oh gosh, 5.5 years ago, I saw the role at Business Disability Forum, I thought, yes, that's kind of my dream job. So if we skip forward, a little bit about what we mean by disability. I'm sure you all know, but it's just interesting looking at some of the definitions. Then particularly a focus on disabilities which are not immediately visible, and then some kind of tips on what I think is really important and helpful on getting it right. And then a bit of a Q&A, if that sounds okay. Lovely.
It sounds perfect, Diane. I was just going to say, we have actually had a number of people already write in with questions, which is wonderful, because of course everything can be viewed on demand in our app, on the online community afterwards as well. So I will ask those questions at relevant intervals, if that's okay. I don't want to interrupt you whilst you're in your flow, but I will ask a few if they're not already covered at the right time. So, so thank you once again so much. And you do keep asking questions in the chat. I'll make sure I keep an eye on them. I've got a number here as well that have been written in, and I'm also with the team on WhatsApp as well. So hopefully you can all see the presentation fine. I'm too scared with tech to touch too much. So I will just go on mute until the relevant time, and I will keep an eye on phones and everything like that and questions for you, Diane.
Marvellous, thank you. So the first few I'll go through pretty quickly. So I've sort of introduced us. So we are a quite small UK-based charity and not-for-profit, and we support businesses of all shapes, sizes and sectors to get better at recruiting, developing and retaining disabled people, and also serving disabled customers. And I'm particularly going to talk about the employee space today. And we have almost exactly 30 years experience, and no, I'm not the founder, and I have been asked that. We have 350 plus members, and globally we estimate that they employ about 8 million plus people, though it might be more now because we've had some new partners come on board, and about 20% of the UK population. So this is kind of a big base. And on the next slide, I've just sort of briefly put an overview of what we do, because like I say, I am from a marketing background, so I have to, I have to sell that. And our approach is a whole organisation approach. So we believe that to get it right for disabled people, it can't just sit in HR teams or disability and inclusion, diversity and inclusion teams. Great though they are, it's got to be across the whole organisation. So this slide is kind of a workshop in itself, but if I tell you that the first one, commitment, is about senior leadership, which I'll expand on, know-how is about people manager confidence, and then all the way through adjustments, premises, products, communication, all these things are absolutely critical, obviously, to the experience of a disabled employee with your business. So that's why we take that approach. And I said I was going to do some definitions of disability. So should be coming up that I've got some of those. Yes, lovely. So at the bottom I've put the UK Equality Act. So the 2010 UK Equality Act defines a disability as a physical or a mental condition which has a substantial and long-term impact on your ability to do normal day-to-day activities, which is quite vague. And quite all-encompassing. By contrast, the United Nations definition is extremely broad and goes into a lot more detail. So persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. Deep breath. But that does get across to you the breadth there is in disability, and lots of people don't really think about the breadth of disability. So if we go on to the next slide, a few facts and figures, and the next one. So more than 1 billion people in the world today experience a disability. That's 15% of the world's population. And then going on to the UK stats, I've got a few more detailed ones. So, oh, sorry, there's another global one. 45% of our members operate globally, and they collectively employ over 8 million people. So then it's the UK one. Sorry, I missed one. So in the UK, the proportion is similar, 13.3 million disabled people in the UK, or 1 in 5, roughly speaking. But then if you carry on and break it down a bit, 18% of working age adults are disabled, but when you get to over 65s, that rises to 44%. And I'm not actually sure what my retirement age is, but it's not going to be 65. So this becomes a real live issue for businesses who want to retain people. And again, people tend to think about disability as something that is present from birth. Actually, the vast majority aren't. So 83% of disabilities are acquired, and I can't remember where I got this stat from, but I'm assured it's accurate, that the average age of acquiring a disability is 53, and that stat becomes less and less attractive every time I sort of recite it, but it makes the point that this is about the human condition. It's not something that happens to other people, it's something that could happen to any one of us. So then going on to the next slide, more positively, I really believe that this is about talent, and this is true not just across disability, but diverse teams have been proven time and time again to perform better. We have a wider range of experience, a wider range of input and perspective that creates better products, better services, and actually more profitable businesses. And one of the organisations we work with is EY, Ernst & Young. And they, not many years ago, did a survey which showed that the teams that were diverse within EY were more profitable, were actually bringing in more money to the business than the ones that weren't. So it really does make sense. So yes, going on to the next bit, my rhetorical question. do you know how many disabled people are in your workforce? And the answer is almost certainly no, although I made the mistake of saying this at a presentation to the Ministry of Justice about 18 months ago, and somebody stood up at the back and said, yes, it's 14%, which put me right in my place. But you probably don't. And the reason you probably don't, going on to the next slide, is that over 90% of disabilities are not immediately visible. I'm using the term not immediately visible rather than invisible, because there are conditions like visual or hearing impairments, whereas actually you might on close inspection be able to see that someone has a hearing aid, but you won't immediately see that. And lots of people I talk to, as well as thinking that disability is present from birth, they think about wheelchairs and they think about physical access. And getting physical access right is, of course, vital. And on a kind of separate hobby horse, it does seem to me completely mad that in 2021 we do not routinely design buildings to be accessible for wheelchair users, because that also benefits people who have wheelie suitcases or pushchairs or whatever. So that is kind of nuts, right? But that's only a small part of the picture. And when I'm talking about disabilities not being immediately visible, I've mentioned sensory impairments. There's also long-term conditions can be considered a disability, like MS or diabetes or cancer, neurodiverse conditions like autism or ADHD or dyslexia or dyspraxia, and many others, and of course mental health issues. And mental health is a lot more in the news recently, particularly post-pandemic, than it ever has been. And on the next slide I've got some more stats around that. So these are figures from Mind. The 1 in 4 people in the UK will experience a mental health problem each year. At any one time, 1 in 6. At any one time, 1 in 7 in the workplace. So this is about people at work. It's not people not in work. And going back to that thing about the human condition, some time ago, I was speaking at a mental health conference, about 3 years ago, actually. And all day, I was on at the end, all day people kept talking about those people, very well-meaning, those people with mental health conditions. And I thought, if these are the stats, this isn't about them, is it? It's about us. It's about all of us. And if there were 200 people in that room, then 50 of them, or indeed us, because I have long-term depression, which I announced to the conference, it's about us. So it's not about putting barriers in. It's actually about being inclusive to everyone. But then, so those are some stats, but why might people not tell you? So my next slide, some of the possible reasons.
Diane, just a very brief pause, if I may, because we had a whole host of emails asking about definitions around what disability means, and also how you would categorize mental health and neurodiversity in this area. And because you mentioned it there, and also thank you so much as well for sharing on the personal story side of things. I know you and I could talk about this all day. I have been taking antidepressants for many years, and you know, I think the more that we talk about this, the more it normalizes it, you know, in particular given this challenging time during COVID, which seems to have lasted forever and a day, but obviously we can see light at the end of the tunnel, thank goodness. Thank goodness indeed. But it is something that I think a lot more, and what we're certainly seeing in you know, through the community and with a lot of the members that we're working with, is that they really are starting to now personally open up. And if they didn't fully understand some of the ramifications, they now are due to the current circumstance. And so I just wondered, and I'm rolling a couple of questions into one here, because I know that you're going to be speaking further and I want to give time for any questions. But I wondered whether you could expand a little bit so that I don't get told off by members on email around the categorization for disabilities, what would be an invisible disability, and how would you know, the intersectionalities ultimately of neurodiversity, you know, ADHD, etc., dyslexia, which I also have. I used to say I suffer with it, but I actually see it as a positive now, because it's a different way of thinking. But I wonder whether you could talk to us a little bit around that for the multiple emails we had. And I hope that me rolling these questions into one is okay. I'm just conscious that there's lots more.
Yeah, that's fine.
Coming, and I don't want to have to.
That's fine. And it actually kind of works well with this slide as well. So under the Equality Act, yes, disability covers neurodiversity. It covers mental health conditions like depression and anxiety. Whether people choose to identify with the word disability who have those conditions is entirely another matter. So lots of people with depression, and you've shared that. I too am a big fan of antidepressants. I've been, oh God, 25 years, possibly, maybe 22, don't know. I have never sort of thought of that as being a disability, but technically it could be. So if people want the protection of the Equality Act, then it can be helpful to say yes, it does count as a definition, but identity is very personal, as I put here, and there's no reason why someone with dyslexia should see that as a disability. And actually, thankfully, there's so much greater appreciation of it's actually a neurological difference, which includes huge strengths. It's a difference. It's you know, it's not any less. I was talking to my husband. My husband has ADHD, which is classified as a disability. And we were talking about tests for interviews. And when I got this interview, got this job, I had to do some time tests. And time tests, I argue, don't bring, is menopause a disability? It can be, but we'll come on to that one. And I had to do these time tests, and one of them was verbal, and I'm fine with that. One of them was numerical, and I was slower at that. I knew what to do, but it took me a while to kind of get it through. Non-verbal, you could have sat me there for a week, not a clue. My husband could do it like that. He doesn't know how he knows, but he knows which shape comes next in the sequence. It's just the way his brain works. My brain doesn't work like that. So I think the more we understand about different conditions, and the more we understand that there are just different ways of thinking and strengths that are complementary, the better it will be. I mean, somebody from a very good organization called Lexic, actually the founder, who herself has dyslexia, we were talking about how in modern society, so often we value delivery over content, style over substance, if you like. And so we were sort of saying, I wonder if Shakespeare got put through a spell checker, and actually creativity should be valued in the same way as accuracy of grammar, for example. And I was talking to someone this morning who founded a brilliant campaign called 50 Million Voices for people who stammer. And again, it was about, we're so used to seeing people in the media, politicians, delivering sound bites that are so slick, we actually maybe don't value the content as much as the delivery. And for people who stammer, that's the ultimate example of that. And so this stuff is really, really complex. And I also I ask myself quite often about whether some of the granularization, I can't say that word, around disability is helpful or not. And I think in some ways it is, thinking about neurodiversity differently. And in some ways I worry that if we go too granular, that we'll end up with kind of all the sexy bits of disability, like mental health now being talked about and neurodiversity now being talked about. And maybe actually people who are wheelchair users will never get their own kind of moment in the sun. So it's really complex, is I think what I would say on this. And some of the stuff I'm going to come on to later, although I have a feeling we might just derail off the slides, which is completely cool, is around whether people don't identify with the term disabled, but still need to work differently and still need an adjustment, and some of the ways that can happen in a way that is inclusive and supportive in all sorts of different ways. I did see on the chat, somebody said, is menopause a disability? And that, given that we are coming up to International Women's Day, is extremely topical, because to suggest, I've had lots of discussions with other women about this, to suggest that something that is experienced by over 50% of the global population is a disability just seems completely wrong. It's a natural part of life. However, we have seen some test cases where women who have experienced prolonged and particularly difficult effects of menopause, I haven't reached that point yet, so I'm not talking from a point of strength in that respect. It has been deemed in law by employment tribunal judges to be a disability. So going back to that definition of it being a substantial impact that interferes with somebody's ability to do day-to-day duties for a long period of time. And that's not intended to be a negative. Actually, it's saying you should be entitled to support. And of course, a good employer shouldn't be relying on the fact that a condition falls under the scope of the Equality Act to give you support anyway, but that protection is there. I hope that answers that question. It's a very good question.
It is a superb question. I love the fact that you say it's the "are you entitled to support" piece. It's a great way to almost clarify, because when we had another email around intellectual disabilities and IDs, and we are very fortunate to be working with Michelle Carney and team at the Special Olympic Games, and their athlete leaders came up with some brilliant almost strap lines, of which we've obviously used in some of the summits, which were around look at my ability, not my disability. And I think it's just an interesting kind of evolution and juxtaposition, us talking about this being something in the negative versus it being something in the positive per se. So yeah, sorry, it's just a segue on from what you were talking about there, but wondered whether you could just, for all listening in, maybe talk us through a little bit around intellectual disabilities and what that also would mean.
So in common language, we'd call an intellectual disability a learning disability. And I spent 13 years working at a learning disability charity, so it's a subject dear to my heart. Within the spectrum, though, of learning disability, and disability rather than difficulty, because people sometimes refer to dyslexia, for example, as a learning difficulty. This is a very, very different category. And it's been in the news very much in the last sort of week or so. You've probably seen that Jo Wiley's campaigning managed to get people with learning disabilities, who include her sister Frances, all to be vaccinated for COVID. But there's a wide spectrum of people from for example, with Down syndrome through to multiple complex disabilities. Some of them are chromosome differences like Down syndrome. Some are things that are caused through birth trauma. When I worked at my last organisation, our receptionist had a lack of oxygen to his brain during birth because his umbilical cord was around his neck, and his brain was starved of oxygen for some time while he was born, and as a result he has an intellectual disability. However, it's a very broad spectrum, and there are lots of people with a learning disability who can work and who want to work and who make brilliant employees and can be the best person for the job. And I'm trying to think of some really good examples. There was one example which goes back a bit but makes the point. We were working with a financial services company, and it was in a point before everything was digitized. So if you were going to get insurance or any kind of financial product, you had to get the finance pack through. And as anyone who's ever bought any finance product knows, it's heavily regulated, and you have to be sent the exact right information in the exact right order with nothing missing for it to be compliant for the Financial Conduct Authority. And this particular financial company had employed all sorts of groups of temps to do that fulfillment, to do that compiling the packs, and they could never reach the level of compliance required by the Financial Conduct Authority. So as a result of which they kept getting fines because there were spot checks. And an enterprising local manager from a learning disability project said, why don't you let us try a team of people with learning disabilities doing this, paying them, crucially. And they carved up the job so it was in different elements. And because the people there were trained really well, and crucially loved their jobs and took such enormous pride in it, they reached the level of compliance that nobody else had. So I really like that story because it's a real tangible business benefit. And if we're talking globally, the Sustainable Development Goals say no one left behind, and the stats around employment for people with a learning disability are just woeful. In the UK, for disabled people overall, it's about 50% versus about 80% for non-disabled. For people with a learning disability, it's less than 6%, which is just, well, woeful. So actually looking at roles that can be done that, you know, don't need GCSEs, don't need this. Actually, they need someone with the right attitude who will love their job and take a pride in it and do it really well. So sorry, I just went off on a bit of a hobby horse, Layla. Hope you'll forgive me.
No, I've got a number of other questions actually, which are around this, and I'm now worrying that we're going to go off piece completely.
Oh, it doesn't worry. Let's just do it. You can always share the slides afterwards. It's fine.
I will move us on, and I will just literally mention this one because, and I do also think it is probably going to come up a little bit later anyway. But and we had a number of questions around workplace adjustment policies, basically, and also how to support. Recommendations for policies and practices to support people with disabilities through recruitment and selection, and whether you have examples of good practice to support people with disabilities when thinking about development and promotion internal hiring activities. So it's a real big mouthful then, and I'm realizing I should have my glasses on because I'm like screwing my eyes up to read it. But hopefully that makes sense. Now we'll move this on because I know there probably are other questions.
It's fine. I tell you what, I've got some stuff about asking people, but we can come back to it. But if we skip through to number 22, I'm going to be talking about adjustments a bit. And this stat is interesting, I think, because over a third of people that we surveyed, and this was a sample size of 1,200 people, didn't ask for requests. This is disabled people who did not ask for adjustments because they're worried their employer would treat them differently. And the figure was the same for people who are worried their colleagues would treat them differently. And then if we skip through a few to, I think, 22, in the law, reasonable adjustments, we prefer to call them workplace adjustments because calling them reasonable sort of implies they might not be reasonable. Almost always they will be. And it's really about removing a barrier that someone experiences in the workplace. So I've got some stuff here around kind of best practice on adjustments, but I also want to respond particularly to the question about recruitment. So we recommend that if you are recruiting, you ask people if they've got any need for adjustments at every stage of the process. And it's crucial that you ask if they need an adjustment, not whether someone has a disability. The only time it's okay to ask that is as part of a recruitment monitoring form that must be separate from the actual screening process. And thinking about recruitment in the broadest sense, in terms of adjustments, it can be really helpful if when you're advertising, you make it clear what adjustments you offer as standard. So things like flexible working, things like home working in the context of COVID-19. So pre-COVID, home working was the most frequently requested workplace adjustment. If you actually make it clear in your advertising that this is something you routinely offer, then that will make a huge difference. But also letting people know that they can work different patterns, that you've got examples of where you've provided people with software or different duties, or one that people generally don't know is things like a fixed desk in a hot desk environment. Whether we'll ever be allowed to go back to hot desks is of course another matter. These are all things that legally under the Equality Act, you can make as a reasonable adjustment for someone with a disability. And in terms of recruitment specifically, it is a perfectly reasonable adjustment to offer somebody a work trial rather than a panel interview, because actually panel interviews test how good you are at panel interviews. And if you've got a job which is presenting the organisation, that's what you're going for, or sales or something like that, then that might be really appropriate and you might be testing the right skills. But if it's not that kind of job, if it's a back office job or a technical job or some kind of operational role where you don't really come into contact with clients, then actually you're not testing the right skills. So getting getting people to show you how they would do a job rather than tell you about it can make a massive difference. And this is particularly true for people with a learning disability that we were talking about. This is also often very true for people on the autism spectrum. Actually demonstrating skills is a lot easier than trying to describe them. Other adjustments that are reasonable are letting people see questions in advance. Because you want, and again, unless the job is being able to respond to questions that are thrown at you very quickly, you know, as a sales pitch or something, you want people to be able to demonstrate what they can do. Also meeting the panel, having a virtual tour of the premises if they're actually going into an interview, and obviously providing things like BSL support or allowing people to bring in a job coach or a family member. If you say up front, these are all things that are possible, then that makes a massive difference. Also, I've got here, I think I've got here clarity of questions. It's certainly one I often use. And an example of a candidate with autism who speaks about this a lot. He says, I often get asked, tell me about yourself. And depending on my mood, I'll either say, I'm William, I'm 50 and I've got grey hair, or I'll say, that's a really stupid question, or I'll give you my plotted life history from birth to this point in time. Whereas actually what you want to know is, what are your skills? Why would you be good for this job? And so we need to make sure we ask those things. And then so down the bottom, just some of these things around just inclusive design, really, products and services. So that stat I shared about 34% of people not wanting to ask for an adjustment. If you make things accessible routinely, you reduce the need for people to have to tell you and ask for stuff. There will always be a need for some individual adjustments, always, but you do reduce the need. So we're seeing some of our members starting to move away from the language of adjustments to talking about productivity tools. So what do you need to do your job well? And that might be equipment, that might be working flexibly. And, you know, if you can work flexibly routinely, you don't have to tell someone that's because of childcare responsibilities, or because of managing pain or fatigue, or because you get anxious traveling in rush hour. You can just do it. Some organisations are also moving towards self-service adjustments. And this was really funny. It got first mentioned a couple of years ago at one of our roundtables. And the rep from Barclays announced this, and you could see everyone looking at each other around the table. So I thought I'd voice it. So I said, I think everyone's thinking, aren't you worried that this system is going to be abused? And it was a meeting in December. And so we then said, you know, unless you're going to buy all your family speech to text software or an ergonomic keyboard for Christmas, probably not. And it is about making that shift to trusting people to know what they need and to get what they need. So does that answer you enough sort of adjustmenty ones, Layla? I think that's most of my adjustment stuff. So my next one, I really like, the next one is just a kind of summary of it. I was told recently, I didn't know this, but apparently a curve that looks like that kind of bell curve, is called a Gaussian curve. You probably know that. I didn't know that. And
I didn't know that. I wish I
there you go.
I did.
I learned it. And the finding is that generally the organisations that are the worst at being accessible and inclusive have the lowest rates of declaration. But also some of the best have the lowest rates of declaration. And that's because they are inherently so inclusive and so accessible that nobody needs to actually tell you. And wouldn't it be great if we could just get to that point where everyone just got what they needed and didn't have to have it as a special thing they were asking for?
Some really great points, because, and what we're hearing, we've even got a question here, which I'm noticing is from an anonymous attendee, which is fine, absolutely fine. But I think there is a fair amount of fear almost of speaking out about this, in particular when we are in a time where, you know, especially a lot of the larger corporate organizations are seeing, you know, some changes in workforce, shall we say. And so I think that you answered those questions really, really well. We'll mention very briefly on this attendee's question. Thank you for the question, first and foremost. So thanks, Diane, great presentation so far, and really keen to start pushing disability awareness and inclusion internally. But very early on in the journey, the topic is so vast. Do you have any tips on where best to start?
The three things that I think are really pivotal. And some of this is, I don't suggest we go back to the earlier slides, but some of these are in the earlier slides. So if you're happy, Layla, we can share them. I'm very happy for them to be shared afterwards because there's more in there. So I think the three things are visible senior leadership. Second is the confidence of people managers. And the third is the practical bit, the really practical support around a really good workplace adjustments process. So if you were going to start anywhere, those are the ones, and the workplace adjustments is the practical one, and it can be transformative. It remains consistently like the top topic to our advice service for our members. It really is the kind of heart of this. But just to touch on the leadership and people manager pieces. So that whole thing around senior leaders have a disproportionate impact in what they say, for good or for bad. And senior leaders often worry about getting it wrong. And it's actually not that difficult to get it right, as long as you go into it with a kind of a spirit of humility, really, and wanting to learn and wanting to get it right. But actually the power of someone senior talking about disability and just normalizing that conversation is huge. And I'll give you a couple of examples of where it's worked for the good and one for the bad. For the good, two examples, both from HSBC actually. So one is the CEO of the UK Bank, Ian Stewart. He talks very openly, very frequently about the fact that he has 3 adult children, and 2 of them are disabled. One of them has a hearing impairment, and one of them has progressive macular condition, so she's losing her eyesight. And he talks very powerfully about, you know, employers who don't meet their needs are losing out on this massive talent. And I think his daughter is studying law, I think, at Durham. And because he has that platform, he talks about it. It makes a real difference. Equally, one of their global investment bankers talked really very powerfully at one of our conferences a couple of years ago about his experience of having a breakdown. And I'm sure he wouldn't mind me saying this. He looks like a global investment banker, a very nice global investment banker. So the power of him sitting on the stage and saying, I had a breakdown, and as a result of that, I reevaluated what's important. I started speaking out about it. I decided I was going to reinvigorate and chair the mental health network. It's just huge. Conversely, and I share this one in case you want to take it back and share. I was talking to an MD of a big company, they're not members actually, who wanted to put in a mental health wellbeing program and was talking to me about that. But it was quite a big meeting. And at the end of the meeting, he started talking about how earlier in the year he'd had an operation on his shoulder, and how he'd been back at work the very next day, not taken any time off, and how his counterpart in another country had had the exact same operation and been off for 2 weeks. And I can only really describe it as boasting about it. And I thought, well, there's no point actually you trying to start a mental health wellbeing program that encourages people to talk about your mental health when you are giving across a message that it's not okay to take time off for an operation. So it is that thing around that kind of disconnect of messaging, and making sure that you don't sort of go over here say, yes, mental health is really important, and then over here we say, well, where's the targets? And what we're actually valuing is the people who've made the most money. So I think that's really important. Another huge subject. And then the people manager piece. Managers so often worry about saying the wrong thing that they say nothing, and they worry about being an expert. And so 2 things I would have as takeaways is, one, if somebody reacts or behaves in a way that is not what you're expecting or is different for them, rather than jumping to conclusions, just take a step back and think, is there something else going on? And ask with that in mind. And we get numerous calls to our advice service with people who are about to be subjected to a performance management process because they're not paying attention in meetings, and it turns out they're trying to conceal a hearing loss, or that they're not reaching the required standard in report writing, back to kind of creativity and accuracy, and it turns out they've got undiagnosed dyslexia. Or much more seriously, a real example was someone who was a great performer, whose performance fell off a cliff, and his line manager had the foresight to say, is there something going on? And it turned out he just had a diagnosis of terminal cancer. So that turned into an entirely different conversation, and it could have been awful. So it's just, is there something else going on? And then also, what do you need? You don't have to be an expert. What do you need from me? What would help you do your job well? And that can be enough to start a conversation. Sorry, again, I've rambled on.
Not at all. I mean, they're just some incredibly powerful stories that you shared there, and already the power in sharing stories makes me then want to share about others. And you know, your point on leaders and, you know, CEOs, managing directors in specific. You know, we of course had interviewed Stephen Wells, who's chief executive for the Co-op, and you know, he has not only led, I think, that organisation with a huge amount of empathy, but also been willing to speak up and out about his two of his children of a combined mental age of 5 years old. And you know, it's that speaking out bravely and in a very, you know, it's a vulnerable place to start almost you know, disclosing things that are happening within the personal life. But as you say, using and utilizing that platform that gives others, as the, you know, trickle effect that we often call it, the permission, in inverted commas, to then speak out themselves, it becomes a far more safe space culturally within the wider organisation and indeed society. One other question that we have here, because I'm conscious of time, I'm afraid, missed a couple of questions on the chat, but we will absolutely share these slides afterwards, along with summaries of everything that Diane's been talking about today. So that'll be inside the app and online as well. And we've got a question here from Jane. Thank you, Jane, saying, we find that terminology on disability differs across different regions. For example, the US through to the UK and beyond. We have, you know, a number of our members over in APAC as well, which again, you know, is very culturally different on the ground. But Jane asks, do you have any insights on reporting on disability and how to standardize these for the different regions? It's a great question. Thanks so much, Jane.
It is a great question. It's very topical because we're just doing a piece of research on that at the moment. So last July, and it's available on our website, or I can send it to Layla to send around. We did a big piece of global research with our partner Shell that was just looking at what global companies were doing to measure disability and support disability inclusion strategies across the piece. So that exists, and it's well worth having a look at, and there are short bite-sized things. But one of the huge challenges that came out was this, which is, how do you do that? How also do you standardize when in some countries it's a requirement to ask about disabilities, in some countries it's illegal? As you know, so you can, you can't, or you can choose to. Some countries there are quotas, there are different definitions. So we've just done a piece of research on this, and the recommendations will be coming out shortly, so we can share that as soon as it's out. But yeah, I mean, there is no easy answer to that. It's a very tricky one and a very good question.
One of those, how long is a piece of string to a certain extent, Dan? But yes, I would say to all that are listening in, we can make sure these questions are answered for you. We can absolutely connect you with Diane. We can connect you with the Business Disability Forum, who have just done an absolutely superb job. I will mention just very quickly, because I know that we're running out of time, and my screen now seems to have frozen completely, oh, there we go. We'll just mention very briefly, in our survey that we did featuring the Business Disability Forum, we had 59%, and this was the UK only. Obviously, we're looking at America now into this year, but it was 59% of the participating organisations on the leadership side did actually specifically mention disability in their org strategy, and that in and to itself is, I mean, near on 50-50. There is so much great work that can be done and needs to be done critically to make this difference. And as you said, Diane, to really allow it to seep through the rest of the organisation, it absolutely must be addressed. But you know, brilliant we have organisations like yours that are really championing this, looking at individual territories, looking at specific research to ensure you know, this can be driven forward.
Yeah, and thank you, Layla. And I guess so many organisations put disability in the too difficult box, and it just doesn't have to be. It just really doesn't. So one of the quotes from our global research last year was focus on intentions, not perfection. You know, just start, just get started, and leadership adjustments and getting line managers just to have a conversation will get you a lot further.
Thanks so much, Diane. This is the thing. This is a challenge. I could talk to you all day, Diane, and so we've ended up not quite getting through the whole presentation, but and I'm conscious that a number of people will have probably 4 o'clock, but we can continue ongoing and overspill for a minute or so. If there was anything else here, I will just kind of flick through some of the we're nearly at the end.
There you go. Questions. Yes, I think we covered most of it. We I think, to quote Morecambe and Wise, it was all the right notes, but not necessarily in the right order. You see, you're all too young to know that cultural reference, but if there's anyone of my vintage, then hopefully you'll know what I'm talking about.
Well, thank you so much, Diane. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I know that we've got a number of our, we've got a lot of our members here. So thank you to those who are still here: Zoe, Russell, Rebecca, Perrin, Michelle, Lauren, Jude, Joe, Jenny, Francis. You know, really, really brilliant to have you all here. And Diane, thank you ever so much indeed for joining us. It's always a joy speaking to you. And I know that we're seeing you very soon, aren't we, as well? So we'll make sure all of the slides are in the app and on our online community at the end of today's session, so you can catch up on demand. You can share with any of your colleagues far and wide. Please do. If you think of any other questions as well, do feel free to put them into the community, and we can direct you straight to Diane. Her team does a wonderful job when it comes to looking at ways to move us all collectively forward. And so thank you once again. You can visit us at www.dialglobal.org. You can also check us out on the Dial Global app. If you go into the App Store, Dial Global Network, and it will be in there. If you need any additional support and any accessibility features, do let us know. We are working with Diane and her team on how we can drive forward best practice and also share other ways to communicate as well. We've got Michelle saying insightful workshop. Thank you. Thank you ever so much. I'm having some messages coming through here. It's like trying to keep an eye on all the tech everywhere, but lots of thanks here. Yes, everywhere. I've got my little spidey senses out, keeping an eye on the WhatsApp, on the LinkedIn, on the email. So thank you, Diane.
Thank you, Layla,
for joining, and we'll look forward to seeing you again very soon.
Lovely. Thanks so much for having me.